I'll just, okay, got it.
Got it.
Right, just let me share my screen and hopefully you can all see this. So, I don't quite know why it's, there we go. So yeah, my name's Dan Merritt. I think I know pretty much most of you at least, which is nice. So I work with Lucy on a project called Bathscape, but this is kind of broader than Bathscape. This is from the kind of genesis of wanting to kind of get meadow owners and meadow managers and people interested in meadows together in this kind of loose Bath area meadows group idea. So this is the second webinar, as Lucy says, that we ran. We did a general one back in the late summer, where myself and Tim Curley spoke generally about meadows. And after that, I sent an email around asking people whether they'd be interested in more of them and what subjects they would like covered. So thankfully people were interested in more. And we had various things. So there was visiting meadows is obviously very popular, one people really would like, and we hope to be able to do that in the spring and summer, Omicron permitting. Then wildflower ID, we might look at managing meadows for different wildlife groups. Equipment and machinery is another one that came up. But the most popular was dealing with unwanted species in your meadow. Are you happy to admit people, Lucy, as they come in? Can you say that? Cool. So that's what we're on today. This meadow, I don't know whether you can actually see on my screen, the right-hand side, unfortunately, is covered by our faces, but this is quite a striking example of what you get for different management in meadows. So I think actually the owner of the meadow on the right is on this call, but on the right of this drung, it's lovely, very nice meadow, and on the left it is donkey grazed basically, so you get a lot of weeds kind of coming in there, even though I just dare say it's very similar in most other ways underneath the grass for things. But obviously management makes a big difference for what we're going to get. But my expertise isn't in weeds in meadows, so I've come heavy-handed with a group of 4 for a panel to talk us through. So today we have with us, we have Rob Randall, who is a botanical specialist. I'm going to describe you as Rob, if that's okay. From Bath Natural History Society. So Bath Nats are one of the Bathscape board members. Another member from Bath Nats we have is Mike Williams, who I'm going to describe today as an invertebrate expert, although like Rob, he has other expertises, and Mike works quite a lot with us with Bathscape as well. And then we have Mark Smith, who is from FWAG Southwest, which is the Farming Wildlife Advisory Group. And I think your title is Senior Farm Conservation Advisor, Mark?
It is, Dan, but I think I often think that's more to do with my age rather than my experience or knowledge, the senior bit. No, okay. But yeah, I've been, well, as you know, I've been doing working for FWAG in this area for, well, more than 20 years now. So, yeah.
So Mark works with us on Bathscape doing the farm advisor role, going out and getting people into stewardship, and there's a lot of land around here. And then we have finally Rob Stevens, who is now, I think, your living landscape officer, Rob.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been in post for just a month with the Avon Wildlife Trust as living landscape officer. Part of my role is Bathscape Meadows.
But Rob previously was Skyline Ranger, I think, weren't you? For the
I was for the National Trust for a very long time, yeah.
Yeah, knows the area well.
So yeah.
So the plan is then that Rob Randall will outline the plant as botanist. Mike will tell us what it's good for to give that kind of balance. We spoke in the last meeting about things like ragwort and friend or foe. And then Mark/Rob will go through control and we'll all pitch in. We're going to take it species by species, so in the order there. I'll pause between each species to give a chance for questions on that specific plant. And then there'll be questions generally at the end when we come to it. So we aim to finish about 8:15, but who knows on these things? Who knows how it's going to go? But hopefully it'll all be smooth and we'll run to time. So as Lucy says, if you raise your e-hand. We can't see you unless you put your hand up to know if you've got a question or a comment. Similar, we can kind of share, if you can share experiences where you have dealt with a weed, either successfully or unsuccessfully. We want to have as much knowledge sharing as possible. So our first one then is Broadleaf Doc. And Rob Randall, if I can pass over to you to say a little bit about Doc.
Certainly. Well, evening everybody. Broadleaf Doc is probably the commonest one that you get in a weed in grassland, but there's several other weedy species too. Curled Doc, which has narrower leaves, and they're the two main ones. And as every gardener knows, docs have very deep roots, and they tend to be perennial. So once they're established, they can become a bit of a problem. Cattle don't tend to like them much. On the other hand, sorrel is another kind of doc, but stock animals seem to like that. Presumably it's not so tough. Docs are very tough above ground as well as below ground, so that's one of the reasons they become a problem, I think. There are other docs like wood doc, which you might get along the edge of a field, but they're not so tough and aren't going to pose so much of a problem as the broadleaf doc, which is the biggest and the toughest of the lot. That's about all I've got to say, Dan.
Okay, yes. There's certainly 3 very common insect species you can find on pretty much any stand of broadleaf doc. That'd be the brown dock bug, the sort of metallic greeny dock beetle, and the small red weevil, there's an Apion frumentarium, and all of them are specialists on sort of broadleaf dock, and maybe a couple of others they might also feed on. And there's a variety of other things that that will feed on broadleaf dock. It's a very palatable plant to a lot of insects, a lot of generalists, but they're not confined to that particular species for food. Interesting that Rob mentions common and sheep sorrel. There's a butterfly, the small copper, which is on the slide right now. A very beautiful little butterfly that will feed on broadleaf dock, but does in fact prefer the sorrels. But yeah, broadleaf dock is recorded as a food plant of it. A lot of aphids will feed on broadleaf dock. This is food for a lot of aphid predators, such as you almost always find ladybirds on or around broadleaf dock. The structure of the plant, as well as its the leaves for food, it's also a really important plant for beetles like to hide under the lower leaves. Especially in the daytime, and spiders often use the stems as supports for their web. I think we've got there the wasp spider, which is a new species only recently found in Bath. That particular one is using it as support for its web. It catches grasshoppers and crickets, and obviously they move around a lot, and it needs something quite sturdy to attach its web to. The other thing it's good for is some birds. The seeds are exceptionally good for dunnocks, really important for dunnocks. And of late, I've frequently been seeing stonechats using the stems in winter as a feeding perch. There's a picture of one there as well. And I think that's all I've got to say on the docks.
Great, thanks. In that case, Mark, can I? Now we've heard how good they are and what they're lovely for, can you tell us how to get rid of them, Mark?
I wish I could, Dan. They're quite difficult to control. I think, docks are identified as injurious weed in agriculture, and they can be a real problem. I think it's the same with, a lot of these weeds. The main thing to control the spread is to have a really well grazed sward, that isn't, poached or, too overgrazed, because once you start getting bare soil at the surface, that provides a really easy means of docks and other weed species germinating. So I think that, you know, that probably goes for most things we're going to talk about tonight. You know, good sward management is critical to prevent infestations, essentially. I think as far as control goes, I think one of the main methods of spread actually is through sort of cut hay or silage. So when the cattle eat it, it passes through the gut and comes out the other end in the dung. And apparently, you know, that's one of the primary ways that docks spread. So I guess if you're the owner of a small meadow, then perhaps trying to if you are cutting it for hay, trying to avoid areas that have got infestations of docks would be a good thing, I think, and that may sort of start to limit the spread. As far as control goes, you know, there are sprays to control docks. Of course, you've got to be very careful and take advice from an agronomist. Although, you know, I've been involved in agriculture all my life, I'm not an agronomist by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, if you're using sprays, please do take advice on what is suitable, and especially, you know, you're looking at protecting the underlying species-rich grassland. I think cutting can work, but it does take a number of years. So frequent cutting, along with grazing, can help to reduce the weed burden of docks, but you know, it can take a number of years, you know, to achieve that. The other thing, I guess, is nutrients, and again, this would go for a few of the other species. A lot of these injurious weeds love high sort of nitrogen environments, so trying to reduce that. I'm guessing pretty much everyone on the webinar tonight isn't using fertilizers, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. But you will get these high nutrient environments where, you know, you're feeding livestock, or somewhere where livestock are congregating under trees in the summer months for shade, as an example. I think that's about it. But I guess that the other thing to say is they can last an awfully long time. You know, the seeds in the seed bank can last an awfully long time, sort of well over 25 years. I think I did see something that curled dock can last in the seed bank for 70 years. So it could be a very long process to get the control you're after. But I think that would be the take-home message would be frequent cutting and close grazing is probably a good way, and avoiding, you know, cutting if you're cutting for hay. Try and avoid those areas where there's a big infestation.
Morris, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask, or are you taking it down again now?
Yeah, actually, the only question I had really was, presumably they spread by seed. What we have is we will cut the fields, but there's a lot of dock in the areas that we're not cutting. So I presume that it will spread from the seed in the areas that we don't cut. That being the case, is there a good time to cut the weeds, the seed heads, before they become viable?
Well, I would say you need to cut before the plant seeds. You know, before it gets to that stage, keep cutting so that you're then the plant is using up all its resources, and eventually it will, you know, give up basically.
Right. Okay. Okay.
I think I'm right. It's one of those where the seed matures or even on the cut plant as well.
Yeah.
So not just cut, but take it away. Don't leave it lying around at the side, even if you've cut it. Anything from any of our other panel members on that or on dock in general? Any other questions specifically on dock, or shall we move on to the joys of ragwort? I think generally I don't see too much in the meadows anyway. I don't see dock infestations. You see infestations in wider kind of farmland, but it tends to be where you've had, as Mark said, that kind of high stocking levels or around a shelter or something where stock have gathered. I think because you've had horses previously on your site, Maurice, you maybe got kind of patches there, but once you've got it, it is a sod to get rid of. And yeah, I think it carries on seeding quite a long way through the year as well.
I mean, I guess I think you're absolutely right there, Dan. I think you do get a lot of dock in ryegrass lays, intensively managed ryegrass lays. So the ryegrass lay, the sward structure won't be as close as a permanent pasture. You know, the plants are reasonably spread, so you do get that opportunity for seeds to hit bare soil, and you know, away they go really quickly. So
yeah, I think possibly with dock it's one of those where it's just a lesson never to leave open ground, because if you've got a 70-year lasting in the soil seed bank and you're creating those kind of open conditions, you're inviting it in. So yeah, prevention is a key one with that. Okay, shall we move on to Ragworts? Back to you, Rob Randall, to introduce it as a species, please.
Okay, Dan. Well, there's several Ragwort species that are native in grassland of various kinds. The common ragwort, as the name suggests, is the one you're probably thinking of. In addition to that, there is one called the hoary ragwort, which is locally quite frequent around here, but nationally it's relatively scarce, and it likes mineral-rich clay soils. And it's not usually associated with meadows on mainly flat ground. It's usually associated with the hillsides around Bath, the steep pastures. So it's more of a pasture plant than a meadow plant, and it's not particularly invasive. Whereas the common ragwort, like quite a lot of the composites, its seed travels on the wind, and once it gets established, usually in a field that's overgrazed, or probably even more so if it's overgrazed and then abandoned, or not only grazed in very small extent, it can really take over. But unlike the docks, the roots aren't quite so deep. So if there's plenty of manpower around, it can be pulled, but you have to make sure that it's pulled well before it might get the chance to set seed. Because once it sets seeds, the seed will float about on the wind from that field or from anywhere else round about. And if you've got bare patches, then obviously it'll germinate. It's a sort of short-lived perennial. It doesn't last forever, but it lasts several seasons, so it will produce seed in successive years, each individual plant. The other one that you get in the area is the Marsh Rag Work, which is quite rare, and you get that really in marshy ground beside streams and that sort of thing. So that doesn't normally pose a problem. It's just the common ragwort that's the real pest. It used to be a controlled weed, and landowners could be fined quite a hefty fine for letting it spread and get out of control. Okay, Dan, that's me done.
Yeah,
Okay. The flowers are really, really good sources of nectar for quite a wide variety of insects. Many species of, we've got there a leafcutter bee and a bumblebee there, but also things like hoverflies, quite a lot of butterflies, and even some beetles will feed on the nectar. In fact, it's a fantastic plant for an entomologist like myself. If I see a stand of ragwort, as soon as I walk into a field, it's one of the first things I walk over to, because there's almost certainly going to be quite a few things buzzing around it. I think one of the most well-known species associated with it is the Cinnabar Moth, which has black and orange caterpillars that you often see feeding on it. That moth is actually declining, partly it's thought due to the control of ragwort. That caterpillar absorbs the toxins of the plant, because it is of course toxic to some livestock, and the orange displays that it's poisonous, so that birds don't go eating them. Now, the impact on the insect biodiversity of controlling it often actually depends on what you replace it with. If you just grass over with 1 or 2 species of common grasses, it's going to be detrimental to the wildlife. But if you put down some nice seed mixes, then it might actually end up being better for the wildlife. But I would say it's a good idea to leave at least a little bit in a field, just because it's a very valuable plant for a lot of pollinators.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Rob Stevens, I think you're going to lead us off on nuking ragwort.
On controlling ragworts. So like Mike said, you want to leave some ragwort. You might not want to leave it right by your boundary, particularly if there are horses on the other side. The traditional way is to pull the ragwort by hand, or with gloved hands, or with a ragwort fork, which are very easily available. And you pull the ragwort plants in the midsummer before the flowers set seed. You try and do it very thoroughly, and it's very hard to not leave some root fragments behind. But any root fragments left behind can produce some weak growth. Sometimes the plants snap off at the base, and you can't help leaving the bit of root behind, particularly if you're pulling a lot of ragwort and it's very time consuming. Very good if you've got crowds of people to do that. It's very important to remove everything off site. You don't want to be leaving any of your pulled or removed ragwort, because as with a lot of plants, the seeds will set partially. And sometimes you see people have pulled ragwort on footpaths across fields, sort of well-thinking members of the public, and then just left them on the ground, and that's no use at all. You want to take it all away. When you do remove it, it's very important that you don't transport it in a sort of open trailer or pickup, so that the seeds potentially blow everywhere down the lane. You can compost it. We used to compost it successfully under tarps in shady places, and leave it to rot down in a sacrificial spot. You can get machine pulling thing that goes behind a tractor called an eco puller. There's a company called Avon that makes these things. Very expensive bit of kit, and suitable, if you've got a huge amount of ragwort and the ground is relatively level and tractor can get there, then you might want to consider that. Yeah, but you do need a height difference. If you're using machinery, you need a height difference between the ragwort and the underlying sward. Yeah, you have to repeat it over several years. You can never just pull ragwort once. You have to keep going back and again and again. It's a perennial plant, so all the plants you pull this year there'll be a whole new crop of different plants next year, and on it goes. But it can work. But yeah, you do want to leave some for the wildlife. You don't want to cut ragwort because you leave the roots intact, completely intact. So all you're doing if you cut ragwort, say if you brush cut it off, is to reduce the seed dispersal later in the summer. Yeah, you can also spot burn using those flame guns, potentially in the rosette stage in the early season. So you have to go around, find all the rosettes. Not the easiest thing to do. But yeah, that is one way of doing it. And the last resort is to use herbicide. Yeah, that can work, but really as a last resort, trying to avoid using herbicides. Okay.
Yeah, have any of you ever had it as a full infestation, a bit like the previous slide, if I go back?
Yeah.
And managed to get it down to just a few acceptable plants. Has any of you worked on a site where you've managed to
Yeah.
get that far?
Yeah, we used to pull on Little Salisbury Hill every summer. Still, I mean, it still happens with that sort of density of ragwort. And you try and get kind of 30 plus people, volunteers up there and pull the ragwort, but you could never pull all of it. Not that you'd want to, but that was hand pulling it, relying on people power on steep slopes.
And how many years did that take to make an impact on it, Rob?
Well, it's hard to tell because you get kind of good years and, well, or rather you get years with a lot of ragwort and you get years with less ragwort. It's very hard to tell really, but it does slowly reduce it because you'll remove it if you thoroughly remove the roots and you're avoiding the seed dispersal. It slowly reduces the ragwort population. But you can't tell by just going back the following year because all the other plants from the 2 years previous that didn't show will be there.
Okay, has anybody got anything from the audience? I know a couple of people said about ragwort at the last session.
Yeah, could I just say, so
Yeah.
I look after Salisbury Hill, and Rob has been many times
Yeah.
helping us with that, which is fantastic.
Hello, Rob. Yes, I see
Hi.
you there now. Yeah, hi.
It's definitely keeping it under control, but we're really not sort of reducing the coverage. So it's an ongoing year-on-year endeavor. I understood it was a biennial, but what you're saying...
Oh, biennial. I'm using the wrong word. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. Yes.
Well, it wasn't just you, Rob. It was, I think,
Yes, I think
Randall as
I
well said it was
yeah.
perennial.
Yeah, it'll last more than 2 years, but not much longer, probably.
Right.
You know, it depends how big a plant it is. It probably
Okay.
lasts longer if it gets chopped off.
Hmm.
Like a lot of plants, they come up for an extra year.
Yeah, so I mean, just going around and snipping off the flower heads, that's just going to make it worse. I understand.
Long term, yeah, you're just reducing the seed dispersal in that particular year if you remove the flower heads.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those annual problems, and and we do struggle to get volunteers to come year after year. They might do 1 year or 2 years, but then it's just like, I've got something better to do. So it really is a challenge. And I appreciate, a bit like the dock, I appreciate that it's about keeping these things in balance because they have a lot of qualities. They support a lot of invertebrates, which is great. But it's just one of those things that's really, really hard to get on top of. And it's a struggle.
It is, I agree. Especially on steep slopes like Salisbury Hill, big areas.
Yeah.
It's not easy. And then removing it off the site is difficult. It takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Martin, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah. I just quickly mentioned the heat gun or something. I was wondering, not having used one of these things before, how effective they were and how much they cost. We've got a relatively small bit of land that we're managing, but I'd heard of these things. But you know, can you tell us a little bit about them?
They're not costly. They're quite a sort of generic thing, aren't they? That people use. You see people using them for weeds in their paving slabs in the front of their houses, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I had an idea there might have been something similar that was not necessarily heat also, but using electrical pulses and things like that. Are they something that might be worth looking at? Or they?
I don't know. I'm afraid I don't know about those
Okay.
myself. All I know about is using a very basic gas, heat gun, flame gun, at the rosette stage, which has variable success, it can be quite high success. You know, there is obviously using that, there's risk of fire risk, there's, you know, fire risks and things if it's dry. It's not necessarily particularly recommended in a, you know, in a meadow situation anyway.
Okay.
Probably better on hard surfaces. Yeah,
All right,
I must
thank you.
admit, I've never done that. I've only ever pulled ragwort by hand. A lot.
So just going into the chat, thanks Ali, who's found very quickly a flamethrower for a bargain price of 20 quid. And then we've got another question in there as well from Paul about government guidance suggests that landowners should control or eradicate it if there's a risk to neighbouring livestock. So in that situation, are you looking at total removal or just doing the best you can, removing most of it?
Well, there's a Ragwort Control Act 2003, isn't there? And that states that ragwort shouldn't be eradicated entirely. I'm just reading from a note I took of that act. Shouldn't be eradicated entirely, and that strategic control is recommended where ragwort threatens the health and welfare of grazing animals and their forage.
Isn't there something in there, Rob, about, I seem to recall from many years ago, about you need to attempt to control it? And
yeah,
I think that's sufficient to, you know, to... That's it. Yeah, showing that you are attempting, because I think it's acknowledged that it's almost impossible to eradicate ragwort, even if you wanted to, which we know there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to, why you shouldn't, wildlife reasons. I think part of the problem, or one of the excuses maybe from years ago, I remember, is that even if landowners do attempt to control it, what about all of the railway cuttings and motorway cuttings where it is never controlled, and it will spread so easily from those environments out into the, you know, the wider farm landscape?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah, and you know, those places are often just flail cut, aren't they? Everything's left. So and they, and there is a, you know, there is a toxicity of livestock. I don't know if it's an urban myth or what it is, but you know, people, it's not, you know, a horse has to eat a very, very large amount of ragwort before it suffers from the toxicity of ragwort. 5 to 25% of their total body weight of ragwort needs to be ingested, which is a very wide parameter, obviously. You can have horses or cattle in fields of ragwort, and if there's plenty of forage, they won't touch it. So
yeah, I think it only becomes attractive to livestock when it's conserved as hay or something.
Yeah.
I don't think
absolutely.
Cattle won't touch it at all.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to cut your meadow for hay in late July onwards, you want to remove every individual flower from your hay meadow by hand. First, it tends to be that a hay meadow that's managed annually, and you know, it will grow. You know, a sort of scattering of ragwort. You don't tend to get high densities, as opposed, like in the photo, which is a pasture most likely, isn't it? So yeah, you don't want any ragwort in your hay, because then it's undetectable. Likewise, if the ragworts flowers are left lying about, they dry and they become more attractive to livestock. Yeah.
Okay. If there are any more questions in the chat, Lucy, on ragwort, or shall we?
No comment on Doc, but when we download the recording of this, we'll download all of the comments as well, so we can share those afterwards.
Great. Or we can, if we want to, we can go.
We'll come back to them at the end.
Yeah. So this field with all the ragwort is over kind of Western Way, and we move on to the adjacent field, which is this one here, and with all the thistle. So yes, if you like weeds, go down that end on the A431 and have a look.
Deary me, that doesn't look too good, does it? Yes. Yeah, creeping thistle is obviously the nasty one. It's the only one of our thistles that actually is a perennial, and not only perennial, as its name suggests, it creeps around underground, so it produces huge patches of just creeping thistle and nothing else. And as you can see in the photograph, it produces huge amounts of seed that blows on the wind. Yeah, the other thistles are all biennials normally. Any other thistle that might get out of hand, by just cutting it back before it gets the chance to flower, it will weaken it and it will eventually die. But creeping thistles are a real problem, although they're rather nice. And they're very, very tough, so they don't get eaten by animals, unlike some of the other thistles that might get eaten when they're very young in the spring, perhaps for a little while before they start producing their flaring stems. Like most composite flowers, they've got loads and loads of flowers, so the insects like them. But I'm sure anyone who's got pasture or meadow doesn't like them very much. Yeah, I'll leave Mike to say what other things enjoy them other than strange humans.
Yes, I mean, like ragwort, they are a fantastic plant for pollinators, especially when in species poor environments, when there's few other flowering plants about. They can sort of be a lifeline to a lot of generalist pollinators. There's a lot of things associated with them, and on not just the pollinators, but the predators of the pollinators. There's quite a common spider, crab spider called Mishuminavacia, which there's a picture of one there sat on the flower, and they'll wait for the bees and butterflies to come along and pounce on them. And if you find a stand of creeping thistle flowers, look for them, you'll find them. But sometimes they'll be a bit more camouflaged than that one. They go a bit more purpley. You've got quite a lot. I mean, most sort of meadow butterflies will feed on the flowers of a creeping thistle, and it's a particular favourite of the marbled white. We have a picture of there. Lots of different hoverflies. We've got there the lesser hornet hoverfly, but there's also the hornet hoverfly. I think I've probably got about 20 odd species I've found on the flowers there at Bath City Farm, including some I've never actually found anywhere else in Bath, feeding on the creeping thistles. It's not just the flowers. On the leaves, you get things like the thistle tortoise beetle, which is quite a flattened green beetle. You also get the stem of a small fly, the gall of a small fly in the stem. There's a great big bulb, which we have a picture of there. That's the thistle stem gall fly. One of the picture winged flies, quite an attractive little thing. The larvae causes the stem to grow out in that huge bulge, and it eats the bulge. The seeds are really important for lots of birds, in particular goldfinches absolutely love them. I've seen flocks of goldfinches descend on stands of creeping thistle in the autumn. Also, I often see, most mornings in fact, wrens hunting amongst them. They love to hunt amongst the stands of them. It gives them a bit of protection, and also I think there's a lot of insects in and around the stands that they feed upon. I'll pass it over.
So yeah, maybe you want to keep your thistles, get more thistles in. Who knows? It's, they are certainly good.
Certainly a few patches are good.
Yeah,
but not a whole field. You want other things to grow in there as well.
I'll pass over to Rob. I might go back to the previous slide, Rob, because you might mention some of the other species that you don't want to take down. So.
I think Mike's point just then is, we don't want to try and eradicate everything with these type of plants. It's about creating a mosaic of habitats, isn't it? That's really important. But you don't want your field to end up particularly like that photo on the right. A sort of nest of thistles, isn't it? That's what it's called. So shall I talk a little bit about control?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So you can dig thistles up if you've just got a few. If your field looks like the photograph there, then you wouldn't be doing that. Like pulling ragwort, digging the plants up is very labor intensive. The roots can go down a long way, up to 3 meters, I believe, into the ground. That's probably very, at an extreme end. And even very small pieces of root left behind can produce more growth. So yeah, these plants are very strong, very tough things. Cutting or topping, depending what you're doing, is the normal way to weaken the root system. So the underground root system can be weakened by persistently cutting or topping the top growth off before the flowers, really before the flowers have even begun, when the flowers have just about started to take on colour, take on the purple sort of colour. So that's the sort of early summer job, really. There's no point topping after they've set seed. So the photo on the right, they're setting seed there. It's too late by then, really. The whole point of topping is to reduce as well as stopping the setting of seed in the area that you're topping or cutting, is to gradually weaken the root system. So forcing the root system to use up more energy to try and grow more flower tops. So you can do that with a tractor mounted topper, and with the height set correctly. So you're not just cutting the whole field. You don't want to cut the underlying sward, just the higher setting. You can do it with a scythe if you want, or a strimmer or a brush cutter. The brush cutter would be better. I don't like strimmers because I think they leave a lot of plastic in the ground as the cord wears down. There are. I mean, you can use herbicide, but again, not really as a last resort. There's also a lot to be said for good grazing, sensitive grazing. So good spring grazing, early grazing. But again, not overgrazing, not too much poaching. So you don't want too much bare ground. Yeah, I think that's okay.
Am I right, Rob, that I think in the spring they have less stored in their roots as well. So if you're cutting them back, then they've already got the least amount of stored energy.
Yes.
Damage them then, so they can't create any more, and you kind of hit them hardest. That
yeah,
way.
you do. You hit them harder. You weaken them more. The thing that all these things need is patience. It can take sort of several years to eradicate the plant. But again, like we keep saying, like Mike was saying, you certainly want some creeping thistle. It's just having a good balance, a good mosaic of different plants in your field. Yeah.
How many of you haven't? Oh, sorry, Mike.
Oh, I think it's also a very poor disperser of seeds. Well, not disperser, but not many of the seeds are viable.
No, they're not. No.
Mostly through rhizomes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's a bit like bracken. It's kind of one. It's almost like you're looking at one plant, really, not 1,000 plants. and it's not quite. But yeah, it's the underground rhizomes that any management that you do, you're trying to gradually weaken that rhizome network. Yeah, which is very, very far-reaching and goes quite deep, and is, you know, hence the word creeping.
Has anyone on the call had any success where they've had a big infestation? You do see quite a few around Bath where it's been neglected sites where they're creeping in from the edges quite significantly like this. Don't know if anybody's got it on their site. No? Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. I have seen it. I have seen it on fields. The fields up at Rainbow Farm used to have great infestations on certain of the fields, sheep graze fields, that would get topped each year. Yeah.
They've been pulling it on Bar City Farm recently in one of the meadows.
Yeah, it's quite significant there, isn't it? On there.
Yeah.
Yeah, in some of the lower meadows it is, yeah.
Okay, unless there's any questions, I suggest we move on to the next one, which is Bracken. There's almost a spoiler alert from Rob and his mention of Bracken
yeah.
thistles. Rob Randall, takes us to the joy of Bracken.
Well, Bracken, yes, it's not a flowering plant, of course, it's a fern, so it produces spores rather than seeds. But as has already been said, it tends to mainly get around by its root system. And where you tend to find it is where a field is near a wood, and it's slowly coming out from the edge of the woodland if that particular field is not being grazed or is being grazed very little. Although we're not in an area that Bracken particularly likes, because they like more acidic soils to really get going. You've only got to go to somewhere in South Wales on the hills to see how Bracken can completely take over in that situation. But around here, it's still pretty aggressive, but doesn't take over to the same degree. It mostly on the edges of pastures rather than in meadows, of course. But I can't really say very much about it in terms of its what it does. Everyone knows what Bracken looks like. It's the only creeping fern that creeps to any large degree in this country. There are one or two woodland ones that creep around a bit, but it's so obviously what you're looking at is Bracken that I think everyone knows what it looks like. I can't really say much about it, actually. Dan, everyone knows what Bracken is, I think. There are things that will live off of it, as I'm sure Mike can say, but I can't say much about it. I'll leave it to the experts.
That's just reminded me, actually, I'm just going to nip back because one thing we didn't expressly say on thistles, this fellow, woolly thistle.
Oh, yes.
Plant.
Yeah.
Please don't kill off. This is marsh thistle above. And if you look, this is creeping thistle. It doesn't have spikes up the stems. It has these kind of smooth stems and spiky leaves coming off.
Yeah.
Things like marsh thistle that have spikes at the stems. Then you have this fella, which you can't really see the leaves very well on that, but it is markedly different.
Thank you, Dan, for doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, the big difference with creeping thistle is that the leaves are very thick and glossy, and the leaf blade is sort of undulates. It's very wavy. The other thistles aren't so shiny. I mean, the Picnicus thistle, the dwarf thistle, is relatively shiny, but of course that's such a different looking plant because it grows close to the ground.
Cheers. So yes, this one we do get quite a lot. You'll see it occasionally in good meadows. It's likes calcareous soil, so it likes good sites, but it's a good one to have. So don't try and worry about this one.
No, leave that.
Right, I'll get back to Bracken. Sorry, Mike.
Yes, back to Bracken. Yeah, there's a small range of insects that will feed on the Bracken. Caterpillars of a few moth species mostly. But I think it's more species that are associated with it, plant species are associated with it that are more important. If you get large areas of bracken, you often get things like violets in particular growing underneath it, which are fantastic for pollinating insects, but are also the food plant for quite a few of the fritillary butterflies, many of which are going quite rare and are now extinct from the Bath area. We know from old records that we used to get things like pearl-bordered high brown fritillary around here, which we don't anymore. And the caterpillars of them will feed on the violets, which will grow in woodlands, but I think the butterflies tend to prefer them under bracken on south-facing hill slopes, mostly. Now, bracken, I don't tend to see large stands of it around Bath very often. I can only think of one that I know of, which is around the back of Lansdowne, but I don't know if Rob knows of any more. Are there any more large stands of it?
Oh yeah, well, just over the Wiltshire border near Dundas Aqueduct.
Oh, yes.
It's below Worley Woods, has been ungrazed now for 10 or 12 years, and the bracken is marching slowly across the field from the woods there. So there's quite a big stand of it in that particular field, which is quite species rich in other species. And of course, what bracken does, it takes over completely, apart from the really early spring flowers. I mean, bluebells can live under bracken, and as Mike said, violets and other very early flowering things will survive because they come out before the bracken really shoots up and produces all the shade.
That's right. In fact, yeah, violets in any meadow are fantastic. Meadows at Tucking Mill, it's the hairy violet that comes out before most other flowering plants, which provides really good nectar source for early bees and other pollinators coming out either early or out of hibernation. And there will one thing that's associated with bracken that's not particularly nice, in fact, is ticks. Will often wait on the fronds for passing animals and occasional humans to latch onto. The stands of bracken also provide really good shelter for a lot of birds and other animals. We sometimes get reptiles basking on the edge of stands, because it's really good cover for them to just go into if something comes, predator comes by. But due to its toxicity, a few animals will eat it. One formerly extinct animal that's now making a bit of a comeback, not yet in our area, I don't think, but possibly in the future, is wild boar. Will eat the rhizomes, really good at controlling it. But, I think deer, tend to avoid it. Anyway, about control.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if there's going to be many sites. It was mentioned by somebody who's wanting to know about the control, Rob, so if you can...
Sure, yeah. We should also remember it's toxicity to us as well, and livestock, but only if you're always, you spend your life amongst bracken. Yeah, I remember being a child, I was always running around with bracken up to my sort of neck in it. Didn't have any idea about its potential carcinogenic effects, which are mild, but do exist. But hey, so there are various ways of controlling bracken. A really nice way of controlling bracken is just bashing it down with sticks. You can do that with anything, hazel sticks, old broom handles, any kind of stick really. And it's kind of job that anyone can do, even children. I used to bash bracken up on Cheddar Gorge slopes years ago with school children and give each of them a hazel stick and off they go. It's brilliant.
I thought you were actually hitting them with school children. It sounded like there, Rob.
No, you hit the bracken. So we call that bracken bashing, and that's where you literally bend each plant over at the base with the stick and leave it there. And what that does, you bruise the base of the plant effectively, and the plant folds over, and the rhizome continues, the underground rhizome network that joins it all up, a bit like with the thistle, creeping thistle, continues to exude sap, thereby weakening the plants. And the growth the following year is much less vigorous, and that's noticeable. If you bash bracken this year, then next year you'll notice the fronds are much smaller. So it's quite quick to gradually get it down, and then the underlying sward has less competition. So you still have bracken, but much smaller bracken, so far less shade. You can also top bracken with a tractor topper, or I suppose brush cutter off the ground. Trouble with doing that is non-selective, so you're cutting everything else as well. So it's not as good. It affects wildlife more than bashing it. Yeah, you can also crush it with a roller, so a tractor-towed roller. Again, that has much more negative impacts on the wildlife and the rest of the sward. Yeah, you can plough ragwort. I've never experienced that myself, which exposes the rhizome, or rather, if you plough an area that has bracken, you expose the rhizome and weakens it, but you also release a lot of sequestered carbon. But yeah, the bashing it is the best way in my mind, and it's quite effective, very effective, and rather quite quick. Quite quick work.
I think on large stands, Rob, bruising with a roller,
Yeah,
with bars fitted across, like I've seen them with angle iron sort of welded across on the roller, so that you are actually bruising the stem.
yes.
It can be really, really effective. They use it a lot on sort of Dartmoor, the Quantox, those sort of areas, and a few years of doing that can really good results for reducing sort of big dense stands. Clearly, if you've just got a bit in your meadows, then that's probably a bit extreme, and your method of bashing with a stick is probably more appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very basic, but yeah, I'm imagining we're talking quite small areas here around Bath. Particularly, there isn't really a lot of bracken around here. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I used to work on the Mendips and on Crook Peak, and big wide open expanses of bracken. Bracken had really moved in, and we used to go up and top it with a tractor mounted topper, obviously raised off the ground, and that did work very well over several years. But it's a little bit non-selective, as we said. Yeah.
Okay, are there any questions? I'm just slightly aware of time now. Are there any questions on bracken? Nope.
No.
In that case, we shall whiz our way a bit faster through comfrey. Rob, Randall, do you want to say a bit about comfrey? Again, not one that's a massive problem, so we'll probably be quite quick on this one.
Yes. I mean, there are several different kinds of comfrey, and in fact, some of them were used by farmers to provide green manure that was ploughed in, but that was not very successful, I don't think, because like some of the other pernicious weeds, they've got very deep rootstocks. They're not normally associated with meadows, unless, of course, you've got a stream or something going along the edge of it. So as Dan says, they don't tend to be much of a problem. Loads of insects like the flowers, especially bees of various kinds. I find them quite interesting plants, but they do tend to dominate where they grow, like a lot of these things that tend to be called weeds, because they produce a big stand because they're perennial and they just spread and spread and spread within a small radius. Not normally a problem for most people. I'm not sure how you get rid of them. I'll leave that to the experts on as far as that goes. Do you want to say anything about the insects and things that use them, Mike?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, they are great for things like bumblebees and a few solitary bees. things like bee flies and also the occasional butterfly will go on them, but it is mostly the bumblebees you tend to get on them. Another thing they're good for is the caterpillar of the scarlet tiger moth, which is a really beautiful moth and quite a beautiful caterpillar actually. But not a huge amount else tends to go for it, apart from generalist feeders. I think I've read about leafcutter bees occasionally using it and cutting bits out of the leaves for their nests. But I don't think I can find any information on weevils and things that feed in it. But yeah, it's a fairly good plant to have around. But if you can replace it with something better, or at least an area of it, then I would say, you know, at least think about it. Anyway, yes, controlling it. I'm not sure how you would.
My only doing with comfrey is on my allotment, which is where this picture is of, which is why it's such a bad picture. And oh yeah, as Rob Randall says, it certainly has a deep taproot. I think, you know, I've had it kind of a couple of feet down just when I've been digging other things out and come around to some, you know, individual I'm trying to get rid of. I think it goes out laterally, and it's one of these again where the bits of stem can lead to a new plant growing. But I don't know if anybody does have experience of getting rid of it beyond that on the panel.
No, I think like people have mentioned, I've never seen comfrey as a problem really. I rarely come across it when I'm out on farmland. And I guess, well, if controlling it by digging it up is going to be difficult because of the deep taproot, then possibly a sniff of glyphosate might help if it's not a, you know, if it's not a big problem and widespread, you know, some Roundup potentially, but of course be, you know, very, very careful that you're not, you know, you're not damaging the underlying sward. I mean, you may get a bit around the plants, but, you know, be careful if the, you know, never spray when if it's windy or anything with glyphosate, because it will drift quite a long way and you could cause a lot of damage. So yeah, if you are going to go down the chemical route, be careful.
Anything to add, Rob Stevens, or shall we?
I haven't on comfrey. I've only got experience like you on the allotment. No, you just used to put it all in a compost heap, really.
Yeah. I think generally there's more about the benefits of comfrey for organic gardening than there is for getting rid.
Yeah, it's well known for that, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, I think let's move on then to one which you don't generally put on your allotment for any purpose, and that is horsetail. Rob Randall, can you introduce us to common horsetail?
Horsetails, yes, not to be confused with mare's tails, which is a water plant that you don't often find around Bath. It used to be in Prior Park ponds, but they're dry at the moment, so there won't be any there now. Horsetails are very primitive sort of relatives of ferns, very, very tough stems, and like a lot of the other weeds we've come across, very, very deep rooted. They go down several feet at the roots. They're very tough. I don't think animals like them. The common horsetail is the one you're most likely to get in grassland, although if you've got a wet marshy patch or a spring head or something like that, you might get one called the marsh horsetail, which isn't so invasive, and it wouldn't be in areas that you're cutting for hay or that sort of thing anyway. And then there's the great horsetail, which is more of a woodland one, likes damp ground either in the shade or near a stream where the stream is shaded. Quite a different looking thing, but the one that's illustrated there is the weed that everyone's familiar with, not only in fields but in their gardens and allotments and everywhere else. I've not seen many creatures using it except to sort of, well, spiders might use it to put their snares and things, but I don't know. Does anything much use horsetails to feed on, Mike?
I had a good look, and there's not much that I could find actually. A couple of weevils and a couple of sawfly larvae. I don't think any of them particularly common, none of which I found around Bath. So yeah, I think it's not widely eaten. I think because it doesn't produce flowers like the higher plants do. It's of absolutely no value to any nectar or pollen feeders. It produces spores, doesn't it, rather than seeds? Is that right?
Yes, yeah. It produces short white stems early in the year, which have got a sort of cone on the top, which produces spores, and then the green stems come up later in the season. That's something that's quite common in several of the other horsetails too. Although the marsh horsetail has a green stem like the one illustrated, and then produces cones on the very top of the green stem, unlike most of the others.
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly valuable to wildlife, unlike most of the other plants we've discussed. Yes, controlling it.
I'm feeling it's rather unloved, but we'll ask Mark about getting rid. Mark, do you want to say something on Horsetail?
Yeah, I think it's if you've got it, you're going to have to live with it. I think, in summary, because it is. I mean, I tend to. You tend to get a lot of it and I guess this is marsh horsetail on damper areas, so North Somerset levels and moors, where I do a fair bit of work. You get a lot of it there, and yeah, in damper areas, but it is really difficult to control. There aren't really any herbicides that will control it, and I think that a lot of that's to do. It's got a lot of silica in it, hasn't it? So it's difficult to get herbicide control. Most herbicides contain a bit of glyphosate as well. So you probably, when you do get it, you get fairly big stands, is my experience. So you wouldn't really want to be using a glyphosate-based herbicide there, because you'd be damaging a wide area of potentially species-rich grassland as well. You can pull it, but again, it's got an extensive root system, and if you leave a bit of root behind, which you're going to do, you're not going to get every bit of root out, then I think it almost always produces another plant from that root. So it's a very, very difficult one to control.
Okay, I'm hoping you haven't got it, because it sounds as though it's not much good for anything and you're stuck with it. But thankfully we don't see that much. I don't see that much of it anyway.
No.
And presumably, if you do cut it regularly and then introduce competition, i.e. reseed the ground, that would have an effect, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Grass mix in.
Yeah.
Flower mix.
Yeah, potentially, but I guess if the root system is quite deep and there are fragments left quite deep, then they're always going to come through, because even if you plough and reseed, you're only going to be ploughing to sort of 6 inches really, and the root system will be way below that. So yeah, I know, talking to farmers on the North Somerset levels and moors, if they've got it, they just live with it, because they know that it is so difficult to get rid of.
Okay, we'll admit defeat, I think, on that one and move on, because we're getting close to 1:15.
It is growing in Bath. I know there's quite a lot of it up top of Wickham Hill. There's one place around the edges of Smorcombe Wood, which isn't wet at all. Yeah, it does very well up there on long neglected old pastures that haven't been grazed for decades.
Okay, we come next to good old Nettle.
Yes.
Randall, do you want to bring us in
Good
this
old
one?
Nettle. Yeah. Well, nettle is an interesting thing. The common nettle is a perennial. It has had a lot of uses. I mean, during the Second World War and the austerity years afterwards, nettle soup was quite popular. You just made a soup with potatoes and perhaps a bit of onion and young nettle tops, very nutritious. But It's another one of these ones that's a perennial with a root system that creeps about all over the place, either just above the ground or just under it. Probably fairly easy to deal with. The one thing about it is that you get male plants and female plants. So if you've got a field with only male plants and you get rid of them, your problems probably goes away. But if there are female plants around, then they're going to drop seed. So inevitably they produce a monoculture of nettles, more or less. So if you eradicate it, you're going to get a lot of seedlings coming up, which poses a problem from the future, no doubt. Very popular plant with insects and things, as well as being edible for the likes of us. I expect you can tell us hundreds of species that use it, Mike.
Yes, I've actually got a whole book on everything that eats nettles, and there is an awful lot. Well, I'll just name a few. You've got the caterpillars of the peacock and small tortoiseshell butterflies. That's the peacock in the photo there. Also, quite a lot of moths, things like quite attractive small magpie and pale straw pearl that you find in almost every patch of nettles. The smaller nettle tap moth, a small brown one, that's often around there in the summer. There's a lot of mostly sort of metallic green coloured weevils that feed upon it. That one is Phalobius pomaceus, but there's a couple more as well. That's quite a large one. Most of the others are quite a bit smaller. They are fantastic food for birds. I mean, a hand-fed robin that I feed regularly absolutely loved eating those weevils, and I think that's often what I see wrens hunting for in the nettle patches as well. They also host large populations of aphids, particularly quite a large green one, which ants absolutely love. They will tend them, they milk them for honeydew, and in return they will look after them, protect them from predators. You always find ladybirds around nettles, and lacewing larvae, which feed on the aphids. You also got several common species of spider that you almost always find on nettle patches, quite a large meadow one called the Nursery Web Spider, which often ties the stems of the nettles together and it makes its egg sac inside. And yes, of course, they are quite important habitats for birds. But onto control.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So again, one that we do like a bit of in the meadows. This previous picture that I had is actually National Trust Field there, Rob. I don't think it's one on your side that you were looking after, but it's the one that's on the other side of Ralph Allen Drive.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I recognised the aspect. Yeah.
If you've ever tried controlling it up there, well, I think it's tenanted, that one, isn't it? That you don't do too much.
Vineyard fields. Yeah. Yeah, it's under the Rainbow Farm tenancy, that field.
Have you ever had cause to try and knock back nettle?
I have done some topping on that field at the very top of it, where it goes into trees here and there. Other than that, no, not in wide areas like that. No, I must admit. But really, that's a field that's been undergrazed for years. That top field, which is, it's obviously the nutrients are quite high there, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things with nettle in particular. It does love these high nutrient environments, so where you've got really high soil fertility. So I think as meadow owners, trying to reduce those areas, whether that's where livestock are being fed or congregated congregating, as I mentioned earlier, that is probably the best way to, not get the problem in the first place. And I think for people with they've got pony paddocks, picking up the dung in the pony paddocks can be a good way of stopping nettle from sort of encroaching. But I think, as you said, Rob, repeated cutting of nettle can be pretty effective.
It can. Yeah. If it's big areas, it's a challenge to then remove everything, which is ideal, because ideally you don't want all that all the energy in that cut vegetation just decaying back into the soil. But that is always difficult in a big area to do that, unless you've got machine equipment that can pick everything up. But good grazing, really.
Morris, you had your hand up. I don't know if you have dropped it again, if you just dropped off my screen. Are you there, Morris? Sounds like we're holding a seance.
Yeah.
Hang on, you're on mute, Morris, if you wanted to.
That's it.
Here we go.
We've got lots of areas that our fields had horses on them, and what we've got is patches, which I presume is where the horses used various bits for latrine sites, and we're pretty determined to get rid of them because they're in the middle of the field. We don't mind it on the edges, but we don't want it in the middle. And I'm got a bit of a quandary as to whether it's worth cutting them and not always raking it away, but cutting them more often, or just cutting them a few times and making sure that I always rake it away. Because we could cut it now, for instance. Since our autumn cut, the nettles have come up again, and now will be a quite good time to cut them, so that they're having to work harder and harder and harder to produce green stuff. But is it essential that we always drag it away, or would it be worth cutting just even if we do leave it?
What do you graze in the field there, Morris?
We don't graze anything.
You don't graze, no. Because you just triggered me to remember something we did it was a little orchard in Bath called Richens, which had a lot of nettle.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
We introduced sheep into that, and actually I was talking to the grazier, a chap called Nick Frere, some of you might know, and he said not to worry. We were cutting the nettle, and I was saying, do I need to rake all this nettle off? And it was high nettle, sort of midsummer nettle. And he said, no, just leave it. The sheep will make good inroads into eating it.
Well, no, that's we can't have stock on our fields.
No, I'm just putting that in as an aside.
I think if it was me, I wouldn't worry about taking it away. Repeated cutting, I think, is probably more important than just less frequent cutting, because you've got the effort of taking it away as well. So yeah, I think I would just go for repeated cutting. I mean, that's what happens on farmland. Farmers, if they're out topping nettles or whatever, they're not going to be picking them up afterwards.
No.
Afterwards, so yeah.
No. And if you cut frequently, they're quite small plants, aren't they? Not a lot being left.
Yeah.
It's really when it's like, if it was that photograph there, if you cut all that and left it, there's a heck of a lot there, isn't there?
There is, and you're then into, if there's that much material, then that is then, as it's decomposing, introducing nutrients to the soil. But I think, I would still go with it repeated.
Right, because ours are about 300 mil high at the moment, about a foot high.
Yeah.
And as it's going to be fairly quiet time for us working in about a month's time, I can see us just strimming that off, and then coming back in another couple of months and doing it again, and coming back another couple of months and doing it again, because they're very localized areas. Sometimes they're no more than a cricket pitch size area.
Do you mean a cricket square? rather than cricket pitch.
Cricket square, yeah, cricket square. Not,
Yeah.
no, not half an acre. I meant,
I've got lords.
20 meters by 2 or 3 meters, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, that's useful.
any other questions on nettle?
It's just lots of nettle love in the chat. So
Oh, good.
get your nettle pesto and using it for string.
My wife made me nettle soup once. Never again. Never again. Right, our last one, which we'll whiz through, I think, because sorry, we are slightly overrunning. Bindweed. Rob Randall, bindweed as quick as you can.
Okay, quick bindweeds. Well, there's only one that you get in grassland, generally speaking, unless it's completely neglected grassland, in which case you get the one that everyone has problems with in their garden, which is either the hedge bindweed or the great bindweed, which are the climbers with great big white flowers. But the one you get in grassland is the field bindweed, which is low growing, and I wouldn't have thought it particularly posed much of a problem in most instances. I guess if you were mowing grass, you might find it making the mowing a little bit difficult if there's rather a lot of it. It's a high summer flowering thing, quite pretty flowers actually, because it varies a lot in colour from pure white to pink and white or pink. It's surprising how variable it is in appearance. I'm sure plenty of insects like it. The root system is not as bad as the root system that you get with the larger species. So I would have thought it's easy enough to deal with if it is a problem. Can't say much more about it, I don't think, Dan.
That's great.
Yeah, again, I've never really seen field bindweed as much of a weed, more sort of a wild flower, really. It doesn't tend to have that many specialists on it that I could find, but it is generally a fairly good source of nectar and pollen for generalist, there's bees, flies, and pollen-feeding beetles. I generally tend to actually rate the hedge bindweed as a much better wildflower for a lot of things. Actually, I don't spend too much time looking at the field bindweed. And of course, yeah, that's the hedge bindweed pictured there with a uncommon-ish hoverfly on it, Chrysotoxin cortum. And you do in the summer tend to get loads of bumblebees, hoverflies, and other things on the hedge bindweed. A little bit is good, although too much, of course, is not such a good thing. It does tend to take over. Yes, on the field bindweed, I've never seen it as a huge problem. I don't know what others think.
Well, I'm the same. I'm not sure. This was raised by somebody, which I assumed was field bindweed rather than hedge bindweed, but it may be that we don't control it because it never needs controlling. But we'll ask Rob and Mark whether they've ever had cause to see control.
Dan, I think probably if you've got big nettle patches, you might well have plenty of bindweed in amongst the nettles, because they both like plenty of nutrients in the soil, which is why they both tend to be weeds in gardens, vegetable patches, and that sort of thing. Yeah. If it's got something to climb up, then the hedge bindweed and the greater bindweed will be found on the edges of fields and in rank vegetation in a field. That would be more difficult to control.
I think that's about the only situation where I've come across it really is in very undergrazed swards. Don't tend to get it elsewhere. I've never seen it as an issue anywhere and a problem.
No, it tends to be those undergrazed rank swards that there are other problems that are greater than the field bindweed, I think.
Okay, we'll save that one. We'll call it not a weed, I think, to end off our discussion on unwanted species. We'll accept it. The opposite of room 101.
Yeah.
Save the field bindweed.
It was probably
anything in
the hedge bindweed's probably the one that's known as a more invasive thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I think where you've got that, but that's largely going to be about controlling whatever tall weed you've got that's growing up at it.
Yeah, and you can. I mean, I once got rid of it completely from a garden, so not a big area, just by pulling it persistently over a few years, not many years, and it disappeared. Amazingly, I didn't think it would, but it did. No chemicals or anything. Just kept on pulling them up.
Round to spend a few years in your garden, and
sort of, you know, pseudo grazing. Pretend you're a grazing animal. Get out in your garden. Anyway, I digress.
Don't eat it, folks. Anybody have a last question before we? Sorry, it's coming up to. Well, it actually is 12:30 now.
Halfway, yeah.
If anybody's had a burning question from the audience, do you want to put your hand up?
David had his hand up temporarily, but it's gone down again, so I don't know if he wanted anything. Take that as a no.
I am trying to say something.
Oh, sorry.
I have for quite a while now. Right, bindweed, the problem we have, it wraps around nettles, and when you cut it, trimming by the fence, the barbed wire fence, it pulls the wire off the fence posts because of its weight. So it's that's the only problem I have with it.
Yeah.
Where it's around the edge of the boundary, and the grass and the nettles grow up over the wire, and it pulls the wire off. It's so heavy it'll pull the wire off the post.
Right.
So the only way there is to trim it. That's the most effective way, but otherwise it's not a problem.
And has the trimming kind of kept it in check, or are you still struggling with it?
No, I just have to do it a couple of times a year around the fence line, and that sorts the job out.
Okay.
You need to watch it if you've got that problem. Otherwise, you'll find all the wires pulled off the fence posts. So
Yeah.
Issue.
That's good to know. Okay. Anybody else? Sorry, I can only see 4 people. Maybe I should stop sharing my screen, actually. But I think what we can do is there's various publications that go in depth. I've saved somewhere some kind of 50-page document on doc in my computer. We can share some links between the panel or between ourselves if you come across stuff that you found useful on explaining about weed species and controlling them. But otherwise, I think that's about as much as we can say on this. I'm hopeful that we will, say in the spring, actually get out and be able to meet up in person and see some meadows, because it's a lot more pleasurable, frankly.
Yeah.
Val, so you've got your hand up, I see.
Dan, I just want to say thank you so much for this seminar. This webinar has been so good. It's been so interesting. A lot of it's above my my station, but it's been really interesting. Thank you, all of you.
Well, thank you,
I
Val,
missed
because
the first one.
I trespassed in your meadow to take that picture of Bracken, I'm afraid. I did see David and asked him on my way down, but
it's been good. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think it's just nice to actually speak about things that we have this kind of common interest in. But
well, yes,
really
and it's increased my energy for investigating what we have in our various bits of meadowland and where we see these various things. And I've said to you when you passed in my lane, well, our lane really, that you know, there was a time when we all thought ragwort was the poison of, but you know, animals don't choose to eat it. I think that paying it is just a really interesting point. You know, if it's kind of cut down and dried, the boys don't know what they're eating. So it's really important to know those things. So thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you all for coming along. It's nice to see a big turnout still for these things.
Yeah, really good. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
Well, I shall try and get the recording out to people, and those who didn't make it, and we'll see you again soon. I'll try and organise something in the spring. All right.
Hope to meet some of you next year.